Hi everybody, this is Dr. Chris Dost. Welcome back to the Biblical Languages and Literature channel. Before we get into our video for today, I just want to share with you a few upcoming courses that Sabra Global Education is offering. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, which will be taught by Dr. Jeffrey Garcia of Alliance University, will also meet 1 hour a week for 4 weeks, and that course begins in late April. In addition, Rabbi Dr. Robert Harris of the Jewish Theological Seminary will be teaching a 1 hour per week ongoing course in the book of Isaiah. And the course is entitled The Book of Isaiah from Yesterday to Today. And this will be an expositional study of the book of Isaiah with some rabbit trails off into medieval exegesis, both Jewish and Christian. And then finally, I'll be teaching the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, an introduction. And that course is an ongoing course which meets 1 hour per week as well. We hope to see you in class. All right, let's get started.
But one of the things you learn very quickly about parables is that parables are literary metaphors, which means that they can be read in, they can mean just about whatever you want it to mean, which is why you'll get the same sermon taught, preached in 27 different ways, because a metaphor, you can take it in all kinds of different directions. And our interest this evening really is trying, and over the next 4 weeks, is trying to hear clearly and understand how those who first heard Jesus tell the parables, are we able, and that this is no small thing, folks, to try to climb back into the setting, the situation in which the parables were told, and try to understand them. And that is it's a requirement of language, culture, history. All those things come into play, because none of us are first century Jews. Okay, even if you happen to be Jewish, you're not a first century Jew. You don't live in first century Roman Judea. You don't. There are a lot of things have changed. Israel. Again, it's important that we talk about language. That in Hebrew, when we speak about a parable, it's called a mashal. Mashal, M-A-S-H-A-L, mashal. And what's fascinating about the term mashal, the Hebrew word that you would encounter in rabbinic literature and Jewish literature discussing the parables, is that it is the use of that term for story parables, the types of stories that you're used to reading in the Gospels, is a post-biblical term, meaning. That means that the word mashal in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, never has the sense of a story parable. That is an idea that gets attached to that term after the Old Testament period. You'll have to allow me to use the term post-biblical. I don't know all of you on this thread, on this class. So, and when I use the term post-biblical, I'm using it in Jewish terms. That's where I was trained. That means something that is post-Old Testament. Post-Old Testament. All right, I'm going to let James Sharp in. Welcome, James. So we are just in the beginning in terms of talking about our introduction to parables here. Again, the term is a post-biblical term. In the Bible, the term mashal is always used for an oracle, a prophecy. Think of Balaam's oracle. That's called a mashal, a wise saying. If you think of the Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, Mishlei Shlomo, those are literally called the parables of Solomon, but they don't mean parables. They mean proverbs. Wise sayings. They're never used for story parables. We do have a couple of examples of story parables, the types of stories with a moral to them. Think of Nathan and David and his story where he speaks to power through a parable, but it's not called a parable. If everybody's following me on that, one of the things that you learn very quickly about language is that language is always on the move. It's never static. It's always dynamic. Our vocabulary changes. The way that we use words today, the meanings that they have today, are not exactly the same they were 100 years ago. So, and it's no different for Hebrew. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't think I am, the first occasion of the post-biblical use of mashal is in its Greek equivalent, parabole, in the New Testament. In other words, the first time we have a parable called a parable is in the New Testament, in the Gospels. Now, if you know anything about the New Testament and the Gospels, oftentimes we find the earliest developments in Jewish life and faith recorded in the New Testament. It's a repository of history. And sometimes it's very, very instructive and gives us an insight in the developments of the life and faith of the Jewish people. And this is an instance that I think that you, as a coincidence, not hugely significant, but for me, it's not surprising either. So again, when we speak of parables, we call them a mashal. Plural is mashalim. That's the term in plural, mashalim. And again, this is a post-biblical use of that term. Again, we began to find parables used in the Gospels and rabbinic literature. One of the fascinating things is that the Jewish story parables are only found in rabbinic literature and in the Gospels. You don't have them in any other Jewish literature of the period, not in Josephus, the Jewish historian, not in Philo, the Jewish philosopher, not in the body of Apocrypha or Jewish pseudepigrapha. You don't find it anywhere. You don't find any parables. The term mashal, which we talked about in the previous slide, does occur 11 times in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's only used in its older biblical sense of an oracle or prophecy. Moving on, language. The language of the parables, and this is something you will read mistakes in New Testament literature routinely. I can tell stories. We don't have time for my stories. That's what happens when you get old. You like to tell stories, but I can't do that. But I can tell you numerous stories of being at conferences where I made the statement that Jesus told his parables in Hebrew, and people were flabbergasted. How can you say that? And I said, Roman Judea was a trilingual environment. At least Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek were spoken there. That, there's no question. 3 languages existed, okay? The question of the language of Jesus is another conversation. What I can tell you is that all Jewish story parables are in Hebrew. There is not a single Aramaic parable, period. So the books that you read, and I have a library full of them, that speak about Jesus's Aramaic parables, totally ignore the sociolinguistic setting of parables. Full stop. I have to say, I was at a conference a number of years ago, top people in the world, sitting at a table with them. Somehow I slipped in, and I was at the table, and they were all talking about Greek philosophers and reading the parables in light of Socrates and this and that, and Jesus' Aramaic parables. And I got up to present my paper. I said, I need to start by saying I'm probably the only person at this table who's actually translated the first 456 Jewish parables. And I'm here to tell you there's not a single Aramaic parable, not one. And I said, if you're going to suggest that Jesus was an outlier, then you have to bring some measure of proof. You have no proof of it. There's not a single one, okay? All Jewish story parables are in Hebrew, and there's no reason to see Jesus as an exception. Jesus told his parables in Hebrew. So we follow that immediately with so he says he's talking to them, they've been able to see, they've been able to hear, they've been able to understand. But not everybody can. Not everybody has had that opportunity. Now we get the real diversion in the various reports. You have Mark and Luke on one side, and you have Matthew on another. And I with all due respect, I would lean more on Matthew's gospel. on this occasion, the preservation. And I'll give you reasons why that I would do that. And Matthew, he says, for this reason, in other words, you get to hear and understand, you get to spend time with me. Others are out there, the people, the masses, they hear me speak a little bit. I have to teach them and present to them in such a way that they can grasp what this is all about. He says, for this reason, I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. It's not for the purpose of, but it's because they already don't see, they already don't hear, they already